You're listening to KEPW LP 97.3 FM on your radio dial. Also live streaming at www.kepw.org. Community-sponsored radio. If you like what you hear, please go online and click the donate button. Every contribution is greatly appreciated. Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. Our mission is to inform, educate, and inspire you to join us in finding solutions to the degradation of our health and environment by nuclear and industrial contamination. We provide an open forum for voices locked out by corporate-owned media, bring you articles and books pertinent to our understanding of these grave matters. Our goal is to leave you inspired to take action and get involved in restoring our environment to its naturally healthy state. We are not assets on a balance sheet. Our lives matter. Every voice is important. Remember, love is greater than fear. Happiness is resistance. Good evening, KEPW listeners. I'm super excited to bring you a book that I've been given special permission to read by Dr. Helen Caldicott, The New Nuclear Danger, George W. Bush's Military-Industrial Complex. It was written in 2002, and it was published by the New Press. I'm very excited to bring this information to you. It's all still very pertinent. Once this book is read, we're going to go back to our normal programming of bringing you articles and interviewing activists. I decided to read this book right now because we are in the middle of a big change in our country in terms of how we are protecting ourselves with our nuclear arsenal and the weapons in space. And I think these things are very important for us to pay attention to and get some background on. So I hope you enjoy the reading. Chapter 1, The Tragedy of Wasted Opportunities. The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the flyer of the F-15, and the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. This was from Thomas Friedman from the New York Times Magazine, March 28, 1999. Imagine this, the Cold War is over. The wise and visionary young American president elected in 1992 decides that now is the time to rid the world of nuclear weapons. 6 months into his first term, he flies to Moscow to meet with a pliable Russian president who agrees to sign a treaty to eliminate Russian and American nuclear weapons within 5 years. Wow. The governments of France, England, China, and Israel follow suit. India and Pakistan choose not to pursue the development of nuclear armaments as a path they are about to take. The United Nations is vested in the international community with the authority and funding to prevent lateral proliferation of nuclear weapons. Hundreds of tons of deadly plutonium are removed over the next 5 years from the world's total of 52,972 nuclear weapons. And we can probably add at least 100 more. We know Kim Jong-un has at least dozens, right? The overwhelming relief that the world will soon be free from the threat of nuclear annihilation catalyzes effective international planning and cooperation to solve the problem of where and how to store the plutonium. American tax dollars are diverted from massive Pentagon and corporate military budgets into projects designed to take care of the nation's people. A government-funded system of universal health care is instituted, and free state-of-the-art education from kindergarten through college gradually becomes available throughout the nation. Woohoo! And our student loan is canceled. Congress passes a law mandating that all cars built to operation at 80 miles per gallon and appropriates funding for public transportation initiatives in every state. Legislation is enacted requiring that most buildings be retrofitted to collect solar energy and that every new building be powered, heated, and cooled by solar energy. Generous safety nets are put in place, providing for the old, the poor, the sick, the indigent, and Social Security system remains immune to the work of market forces. Every American child is fully immunized, and no child will live below the poverty line. Almost 5 decades since the dawn of the atomic age, The United States of America is on the way to becoming truly secure, no longer dependent on a nuclear barricade for its safety. The nation becomes an inspirational example to all other nations as we enter the 21st century. Now blink and re-enter reality. I love Helen. A newly elected young president, touched paradoxically with hubris and timidity, who had never acquired an in-depth knowledge of the matter of military or nuclear, was handicapped by a severe leadership impediment. He had evaded the Vietnam draft. In his own mind, he never overcame this apparent character deficit, and the military that he allegedly commanded made sure he never forgot it. To exacerbate this situation, several acute personal problems of a deeply embarrassing, not to mention compromising, nature occupied this president to the point where he contemplated possible resignation and faced actual impeachment. So let us remember that the Clinton black dress investigation about Bill Clinton getting a blowjob went on for 6 years, you guys. And we have a traitor in the White House right now who's going to meet with Russia, and the Republicans, refused to hold a single hearing on the Russians manipulating or hacking into our election system. And they are feeding every bit of information that they can squeeze out of Mueller to the fucking White House. So we've got, it's not just traitor Trump. We have a treasonous GOP. So let me get back to this book, because that point really drives home when we remember how long Bill Clinton was tortured over a fucking blowjob. It just blows me away. Partly to compensate for these deficiencies, Clinton used U.S. military forces overseas in Bosnia, Iraq, and Kosovo, among other places, more frequently than any other president in the last 20 years. Further, he was the only administration since Eisenhower's that did not negotiate a single significant nuclear arms control treaty. Bill Clinton's basic disinterest, distraction, draft handicap, and lack of vision allowed the military, Pentagon, nuclear scientists, and military corporations to move into this presidential vacuum. They wooed, seduced, and bought Congress and the administrative staff, and the opportunity for nuclear disarmament was tragically lost. Ironically, as we enter the 21st century, after 8 years of a Democratic administration, the world is in a position even more dangerous than it was at the height of the Reagan buildup of nuclear weapons and the Star Wars dreams. It is against this unfortunate backdrop that the events of September 11, 2001 took place, adding ominously to the possibility of international nuclear war or nuclear accidents, as the U.S. nuclear arsenal was placed at the highest state of alert and international tensions arose. U.S. nuclear policy and weaponry has never been more aggressive. And then there are bullet points, okay? The U.S. currently has 2,000 intercontinental land-based hydrogen bombs, 3,456 nuclear weapons on submarines roaming the seas 15 minutes from their targets, and 1,750 weapons on intercontinental planes ready for delivery. Of these 7,206 weapons, and I will add that we know of, roughly 2,500 remain on hair-trigger alert, ready to be launched at the press of a button. Keep that in mind when you think about the lunatic in the White House. Russia has a similar number of strategic weapons, with approximately 2,000 on hair-trigger alert. In total, there are now enough explosive power in the combined nuclear arsenals of the world to overkill every person on Earth 32 times. The U.S. currently has in place plans to fight and win a nuclear war, and is prepared to use nuclear weapons first if necessary. How do you win a nuclear war? Winning a nuclear war with Russia, for example, requires the use of anti-satellite weaponry to destroy Russian early warning systems and a secret preemptive first strike attack to destroy Russian missiles before they can be launched from their silos, and preemptive destruction of the Russian nuclear subs in port and at sea, all of which capabilities are currently in place. Any Russian missiles escaping the initial attack would have to be destroyed en route to the U.S. in space, using a newly developed U.S. ballistic missile defense system. The Pentagon's official targeting plan, the Single Integrated Operation Plan, SIOP, S-I-O-P, that's what it's called, Single Integrated Operation Plan, has been upgraded since 1989. The Pentagon's official targeting plan, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, has been upgraded since 1989. Instead of a total of 2,500 targets, there are now 3,000. These include 2,260 Russian sites, 1,100 of which are ostensibly nuclear facilities, 160 of which are, quote, leadership targets, government offices, and military command centers. And in parentheses, she says, in a country almost devoid of leadership, and 500 of which are disintegrating factories that produced almost no arms last year. China is now included in SIOP for the first time in 20 years, despite the fact that the U.S. Senate moved to normalize relations with China by granting it permanent normal trading relations status, PNTR, in September 2000. This country of 1.3 billion people, potentially a huge market for the U.S., has only 20 nuclear missiles capable of reaching America. And no doubt by now they have way more. Non-nuclear nations such as Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are also targeted with nuclear weapons for the first time. Before the 1990s, the U.S. had targeted only other countries with nuclear weapons. The U.S. Department of Energy's nuclear laboratories, Los Alamos and Sandia in New Mexico, and Lawrence Livermore in California, are embarked on a second Manhattan Project. Well, let's just say they never stopped the first one. How about that? A massive scientific undertaking costing $5 to $6 billion annually for the next 10 to 15 years to design, test, and develop new nuclear weapons under the guise of ensuring the safety and reliability of the U.S. current stockpile of nuclear weapons. This is twice the cost of the original Manhattan Project, which developed the first 3 atomic bombs in the early 40s, and significantly more than the average of $3.8 billion spent on nuclear weapons during the Cold War. The Bush administration has pledged to fast-track plans to new national missile defense system. This runs the risk of destabilizing the many arms control treaties already negotiated between Russia and America. Who are the enemies that America is so frantically and expensively arming against at the dawn of the 21st century? Until September 11, 2001, America had no enemies with potential to wreak real harm on its land or people. It has friendly countries to the north and south, and vast oceans to the east and west. Under the current configuration, no foreign nation would ever think of invading the U.S., but it is now apparent that America has terrorist enemies, amorphous, difficult to track and locate, and almost impossible to extinguish by firepower or enormous arsenals of weapons. And on this, Dr. Caldicott, I really strongly disagree. I think America created these terrorists to promote war. I think that it was all set up by the industrial military complex, but I digress. The Pentagon and State Department justify the extraordinary U.S. military expenditure, now $310 billion annually, which is way more now, with potential threats from North Korea, Iran, Iraq, China, Russia, and possibly Libya, which they've decimated Libya by now. That's long gone. But of these, only the 5,000, and they decimated Iraq. Of these, only the 5,000 strategic nuclear weapons in Russia, half of which could hit U.S. cities 30 minutes after launching, pose a major threat to American security. More relevantly, as recent events have made all too clear, the largest nuclear stockpile in the world can accomplish little in the face of terrorists armed with box cutters, except possibly offering the potential for terrifying escalation of any ensuing conflict between nations. America currently spends 22 times as much on its military forces as all the other so-called rogue states or the states of concern: Iraq, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and Libya. What were they called? The evil axis. Put together, when nullification of any of these threats they might pose could be achieved for a fraction of that amount. Other possible explanations for America's immense military expenditures include: it fattens the coffers of weapons makers. Ding, 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 ding. It is a direct result of the rivalry between the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, each of whom want to have their own weapons systems. It elevates the prestige of top lawmakers within Congress and the White House, who are the recipients of huge donations from weapons manufacturers as they legislate for more weapons. A huge conventional and nuclear arsenal allows America to do what it will around the world with impunity. It is the iron hand in a velvet glove of U.S. corporate globalization. And it also provides complete cover. They don't have to talk about the nuclear contamination. We're talking about building weapons. We're not talking about the horrible things that this stuff has done to us. All of this is why Clinton's failure to seize the opportunity to eliminate or pare down the number of nuclear weapons in the world through rapid and realistic negotiation with Russia at a time when this was possible is so deeply tragic. Yeah, well, Dr. Caldicott, did you actually believe Bill Clinton would do jack? I mean, he set his priorities straight. What he wanted is what he got in the White House, and he paid 6 years of investigation for it. Ironically, it may well be the very fact that the September 11th attack and the U.S.'s resulting need to adopt a more conciliatory stance towards Russia that leads George W. Bush to enact the stockpile reductions that eluded Clinton in calmer times. The nuclear weapons establishment has 4 arms: the nuclear scientists, the military corporations, Congress, plus the White House, and the Pentagon. Subsequent chapters will look at each of these in turn, but first, let's set the stage by imagining what nuclear war might really look like. The reality of nuclear war. What will likely be the final conclusion to incessant nuclear war planning? The destruction of the planet. And such an event could be triggered tonight or tomorrow by human or computer error, or even by a terrorist attack. What would nuclear war be like? Medical consequences of nuclear war. If launched from Russia, nuclear weapons would explode over American cities 30 minutes after takeoff. China's 20 missiles are liquid-fueled, not solid fuel. They take many hours to fuel and could not be used in a surprise attack, but they would produce similar damage if launched. Other nuclear-armed nations, such as India and Pakistan, do not have the missile technology to attack the U.S. It is assumed that most cities with a population of over 100,000 people are targeted by Russia. This little town of Eugene is targeted by Russia. We have like 180,000 people. During these 30 minutes, the U.S. early warning infrared satellite detectors signal the attack to the Strategic Air Command in Colorado. They in turn notify the president, great, who has approximately 3 minutes to decide whether or not to launch a counterattack. In the counterforce scenario the U.S. government currently embraces, he does launch, the missiles pass mid-space, and the whole operation is over within an hour. Landing at 20 times the speed of sound, nuclear weapons explode over cities, with heat equals to that inside the center of the sun. There is practically no warning except the emergency broadcast system on the radio or TV, which gives the public only minutes to reach the nearest fallout center, assuming there is one. There is no time to collect children or immediate family members. The bomb or bombs, because most major cities will be hit with more than one explosion, will gouge out craters 200 feet deep and 1,000 feet in diameter if they explode at ground level. Most, however, are programmed to produce an airburst, which increases the diameter of the destruction, but creates a shallower crater. Half a mile from the epicenter, all buildings will be destroyed, and at 1.7 miles, only reinforced concrete buildings will remain. At 2.7 miles, bare skeletons of buildings will stand, Single-family residences will have disappeared. 50% are dead, and 40% are severely injured. So what does that mean? The other 10% aren't severely injured. Bricks and mortar are converted to missiles traveling at hundreds of miles an hour. Bodies have been sucked out of buildings and converted to missiles themselves, flying through the air at 100 miles per hour. Severe overpressures, pressures many times greater than normal atmospheric pressure, have popcorned windows, produce millions of shards of flying glass, causing decapitations and shocking lacerations. Overpressures have entered the nose, mouth, and ears, inducing rupture of lungs and rupture of the tympanic membranes and eardrums. Most people will suffer severe burns. In Hiroshima, which was devastated by a very small bomb, 13 kilotons compared to the current 1,000 kilotons. A child actually disappeared, vaporized, leaving his shadow in the concrete pavement behind him. A mother was running, holding her baby, and both she and her baby were converted to a charcoal statue. The heat will be so intense that dry objects, furniture, clothing, and dry wood will spontaneously ignite. Humans will become walking, flaming torches. 40 or 50 miles from the explosion, people will instantly be blinded from retinal burns if they glance at the flash. Huge firestorms will engulf thousands of square miles, fanned by winds from the explosion that transiently exceed 1,000 miles per hour. People in fallout shelters will be asphyxiated as fire sucks oxygen from the shelters. This happened in Hamburg after the Allied bombing in World War II, when temperatures within the shelters caused by conventional bombs reached 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit. Fallout. Most of the city and its people will be converted to radioactive dust shot up in a mushroom cloud. The area of lethal fallout from this cloud will depend upon the prevailing wind and weather conditions. It could cover thousands of square miles. Doses of 5,000 rads, a rad is a measure of radiation dose, or more experienced by people close to the explosion, if they are still alive, will produce acute encephalopathic syndrome. The cells of the brain will become so damaged that they would swell. Because the brain is enclosed in a fixed bony space and there is no room for the swelling, so the pressure inside the skull rises, inducing symptoms of excitability, acute nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, severe headache, and seizures, followed by coma and death within 24 hours. Oh, joy. Probably much better just to die, right? A lower dose of 1,000 rads causes death from gastrointestinal symptoms. The lining of the gut die, as do the cells in the bone marrow that fight infection and that cause blood clotting. Mouth ulcers, loss of appetite, severe colicky abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and blood diarrhea occur within 7 to 14 days. Death follows severe fluid loss, infection, hemorrhage, and starvation. Great. At 450 rads, 50% of the population dies. Hair drops out, vomiting and bloody diarrhea occurs, accompanied by bleeding under the skin and from the gums. Death occurs from internal hemorrhage, generalized septicemia, and infection. I don't know this word. septicemia, septicemia. Severe trauma and injuries exacerbate the fallout symptoms, so patients die more readily from lower doses of radiation. Infants and children and old people are more sensitive to radiation than healthy adults. Within bombed areas, fatalities will occur from the combination of trauma, burns, and radiation sickness and starvation. There will be virtually no medical care for even the relief of pain because most physicians work within the targeted areas. Terrorist targets, post-September 11, 2001. And we can see how our federal government is protecting them, like they're protecting our vote, right? Disease. Millions of decaying bodies, human and animal alike, will rot, infected with viruses and bacteria that will mutate in the radioactive environment to become more lethal. Trillions of insects naturally resistant to radiation. Fleas, flies, cockroaches, and lice will transmit disease from the dead to the living, to people whose immune mechanisms have been severely compromised with the high levels of radioactive background radiation. Rodents will multiply by the millions among the corpses in the shattered sewage systems. Epidemics of disease now controlled by immunization and the good hygiene will reappear. Measles, polio, typhoid, cholera, whooping cough, diphtheria, smallpox, plague, tuberculosis, meningitis, malaria, and hepatitis. Anyone who makes it to a fallout shelter and is not asphyxiated in it will need to stay there for at least 6 months. God dang. I couldn't do that. Until the radiation decays sufficiently so outside survival is possible. It has been postulated that perhaps older people should be sent outside to scavenge for food because they will not live long enough to develop malignancies from the fallout, like cancer and leukemia, have long incubation periods ranging from 5 to 60 years. But any food that manages to grow will be toxic because plants concentrate radioactive elements. Nuclear winter. Finally, we must examine the systematic global effects of the nuclear war. Firestorms will consume oil wells, chemical facilities, cities, forests, covering the earth with a blanket of thick, black radioactive smoke, reducing sunlight to 70% of normal. 1 year or more will be required for light and temperature to return to normal, perhaps supernormal values, as sunlight would return to more than its usual intensity, enhanced in the ultralight spectrum by depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer. Sub-freezing temperatures would destroy the biological support system for civilization, resulting in massive starvation, thirst, and hypothermia. To quote a 1985 scope document published by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the total loss of human agricultural and societal support systems would result in the loss of almost all humans on Earth, essentially equally among combatant and non-combatant countries alike. This vulnerability is an aspect not currently a part of the understanding of nuclear war. Not only are there major combatant countries in danger, but virtually the entire human population is being held hostage to the large-scale use of nuclear weapons. That was in 1985, published by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. The proposed START III treaty between Russia and America, even if it were implemented, would still allow 3,000 to 5,000 hydrogen bombs to be maintained on alert. The threshold for nuclear winter? 1,100 kiloton bombs blowing up 100 cities. A distinct possibility given current capabilities. Now remember, when was this book written? I think it was 2004. That's what I said, right? 2002. Accidental Nuclear War, new subtitles. Accidental Nuclear War. On January 25th, 1995, military technicians at radar stations in northern Russia detected signals from an American missile that had just been launched off the coast of Norway carrying a U.S. scientific probe. Although the Russians had been previously notified of this launch, the alert had been forgotten or ignored. Aware that the U.S. submarines could launch a missile containing 8 deadly hydrogen bombs 15 minutes from Moscow, Russia officials assumed that America had initiated a nuclear war. For the first time in history, the Russian computer containing nuclear launch codes was opened. President Boris Yeltsin, sitting at that computer being advised on how to launch a nuclear war by his military officers, he had only a 3-minute interval to make a decision. At the last moment, the U.S. missiles veered off course. He realized that Russia was not under attack. If Russia had launched its missiles, the U.S. early warning satellites would immediately have detected them and radioed back to Cheyenne Mountain. This would have led to the notification of the president, who would also have had 3 minutes to make his launch decision. And America's missiles then would have been fired from their silos. We were thus within minutes of global annihilation that day. Today, Russia's early warning and nuclear command systems are deteriorating. Russia's early warning system fails to operate up to 7 hours a day because only 1/3 of its radars are functional, and 2 of the 9 global geographical areas covered in its missile warning satellites are not under surveillance for missile detection. To make matters worse, The equipment controlling nuclear weapons malfunctions frequently, and the critical electronic devices and computers sometimes switch to combat mode for no apparent reason. Oh, that's just great. I don't know about you, but this does not give you confidence, right? No shit, Sherlock. I mean, at some point in my life, I thought that they were managing it. I had no idea it was this incompetent on every level. Okay, according to the CIA, 7 times during the... You're listening to KEPW LP 97.3 on your FM dial. Also, live streaming worldwide at www.kepw.org. Fall of 1996, operations at some Russian nuclear weapons facilities were severely disrupted when robbers tried to mine critical information cables for their copper. This vulnerable Russian system could easily be stressed by an internal or international political crisis. Donald Trump. When the danger of an accidental or indeed intentional nuclear war would become very real. And the U.S. itself is not invulnerable to error. In August 1999, for example, when the National Imagery and Mapping Agency was installing a new computer system to deal with the potential Y2K problems, this operation triggered a computer malfunction which rendered the agency blind for days. For more than 8 months, it took more than 8 months for the defect to be fully repaired. As the New York Times reported, part of America's nuclear early warning system was rendered incompetent for almost a year. At that time, I was sitting at a meeting in the West Wing of the White House discussing potentially dangerous Y2K nuclear weapon glitches. Several Pentagon officials blithely reassured me that everything would function normally during the rollover. But in fact, their intelligence system had already been disabled. Do you get that? You guys get that? They intentionally lied to Dr. Caldicott when she was talking to them. Such a situation has the potential for catastrophe. If America cannot observe what the Russians are doing with their nuclear weapons or vice versa, especially during this serious international crisis, they are likely to err on the side of caution, which could mean that something as benign as the launch of a weather satellite could actually trigger annihilation of the planet. This situation became even more significant after the September 11 attack. So that's the end of chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 is quite long. I'm going to have it be its own show. So last night I was looking online in regards to weapons in space, Dr. Carl Grossman's book that I'm reading on Monday night, and I was thinking, that vision for 2020 was written in the late 80s. I wonder where we're at now. And I came across an article that blew my socks off. The title of it says, Pentagon to start creating Space Force even before Congress approves it. Written on July 31st, 2018 by Marcus Weisgerber. I found it on defense1.com. I'm going to read it to you pretty quickly. I hope I have time in the next 20 minutes. The U.S. Defense Department this week will take the first steps to create the Space Force, a new branch of the military ordered up by President Trump but not yet fully backed by Congress. In coming months, Defense Department leaders plan to stand up 3 of the 4 components of the new Space Force: a new combatant command for space, a new joint agency to buy satellites for the military, and a new warfighting community that draws space operators from all service branches. These sweeping changes, on par with the past decade's establishment of cyber forces, are the part the Pentagon can do without lawmakers' approval. Creating the 4th component, an entirely new branch of the military with services and support functions such as financial management and facilities construction, will require congressional action. Defense officials plan to spend the rest of 2018 building a legislative proposal for the authorities necessary to establish the Space Force. This would go to Congress early next year as part of the Trump administration's 2020 budget proposal. This plan, developed for execution by Deputy Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, The Pentagon's number 2 civilian is laid out in a 14-page draft report slated to go to lawmakers on Wednesday. That's today, August 1st. Defense One reviewed a draft of the report dated July 30. Quote, the Department of Defense is establishing a space force to protect our economy through deterrence of malicious activities, ensure our space systems meet national security requirements, and provide vital capabilities to joint and coalition services across the spectrum of conflict, unquote, says the draft report. Quote, DoD will usher in a new age of space technology and field new systems in order to deter and, if necessary, degrade, deny, disrupt, destroy, and manipulate adversary capabilities to protect U.S. interests, assets, and way of life. This new age will unlock growth in the U.S. industrial base, expand the commercial space economy, and strengthen partnerships with our allies, unquote. The Pentagon declined to comment on the report in advance of its formal release later this week. New forces. The draft report says the Pentagon will, by year's end, that's 2018, establish an 11th Unified Combatant Command, the U.S. Space Command. Like U.S. Space Special Operations Command, which oversees special forces composed of service members and organizations drawn from various service branches, the 4-star Space Command will oversee space forces from across the military. The proposal goes even further than lawmakers demanded in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which orders the Pentagon to create a space command under U.S. Strategic Command. The department will recommend that the President revise the Unified Campaign Plan to create the new U.S. Space Command by the end of 2018 and evaluate the need for any additional personnel, responsibilities, and authorities, the draft report says. Initially, the Pentagon will recommend that the head of Air Force Space Command also serve as the commander of U.S. Space Command. Space liaisons will be installed in the geographic combatant commands, starting with U.S. European Command. The draft report says that the Pentagon will also stand up a space operations force made up of uniformed and civilian space personnel from our 4 military services and the National Guard and Reserve. Similar to Special Forces personnel provided by all military services, the Space Operations Force will be composed of the space personnel from all military services, but developed and managed as one community, it says. This force will come together quickly. The goal is to deploy, quote, teams of space experts, unquote, to U.S. European Command and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command by next summer, 2019, folks. New subtitle, New Ways to Procure Satellites. The draft report heralds seismic changes in how the Pentagon buys, launches, and develops new technologies for its satellites, including organizational and cultural shifts to emphasize speed and experimentation. It also plans a bigger role for private sector space companies as, quote, commercial and government entities move toward the center on requirements, regulation, and compliance, unquote. The centerpiece of this effort is the new joint office, dubbed the Space Development Agency, to oversee new satellite development and space launch contracts. Major existing acquisition programs will remain in current service organizations and aggressively pursue improved performance, while the Space Development Agency develops and fields the capabilities outlined in the DoD Space Vision, the draft report says. Quote, over time, as current programs complete, resources will shift from service space acquisition organizations to the Space Development Agency, unquote. The biggest impact will be on the Air Force. The move clouds the future of the service's Space and Missile Systems Center, the 6,000-person organization in Los Angeles that currently oversees about 85% of DoD's space procurement budget. And it was recently restructured to speed the purchase and launch of satellites. The report calls this overhaul the start. Like the Missile Defense Agency, the Space Development Agency would oversee acquisition projects across the various military services. Its size will be determined by a DoD governance committee in partnership with the intelligence community, the report says. Its location will be determined through an accelerated process that considers locations that best enable the agency to attract talent, leverage commercial expertise, and develop new capabilities at speed and scale. Currently, the Air Force has hubs for space in Colorado, California, and Florida. The Army and Missile Defense Agency have a large presence in Huntsville, Alabama, an area nicknamed Rocket City for its large role in NASA and military space projects. The city is also known as Pentagon South due to the high concentration of Defense Department civilians there. The report, which responds to a congressional mandate in the 2018 Defense Authorization Act, was largely written by Shanahan's office and by Stephen Kittay, Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Space Policy, according to a senior defense official. Air Force officials were largely cut out of the review process several weeks ago. The official and another source with knowledge of the decision said on the condition of anonymity to speak about the yet-to-be-released report. New subtitle, From Idea to Plan. The idea of creating a new service-level organization to handle the military space operations has been contentious since lawmakers last year proposed to attach a Space Corps to the Air Force along the lines of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Pentagon leaders, including Trump's own Air Force Secretary, largely opposed that move. But in recent months, the president has mulled and then stated his desire for a Space Force. If it would become reality, it is the first new branch of the military since the Air Force was born out of the Air Army Corps in 1947. Both the Chief of Staff and I are actually very glad that people are becoming more aware and having a debate about what we do about this as a nation. This just wasn't really there before, Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson said during a Washington Post event in July 25. That lady is a doggone liar. I'm reading a book called Weapons in Space, outlining the government's thirst for dominance in space, and it was written in the mid-'80s, and it's called Vision for 2020. Back to this article. I think the most important thing is to stay focused on the warfighter and maintaining the lethality of the service, no matter how the org chart boxes go, Wilson said. It's all about the ability to fight. If we keep focused on that and not on which boxes move around to which in the Pentagon, then we'll do the right thing for the nation, unquote. Wilson's predecessor, Deborah Lee James, also served as Air Force Secretary during the Obama administration, said Monday that she opposes a Space Force, but she supports the creation of a combatant command like the one discussed in Shanahan's report. She made her comments at a Brookings Institute event in Washington. In recent years, the Air Force made numerous changes within its space arm to defend against Russian and Chinese interference. This week, the Pentagon is poised to announce a shift from, quote, a few independent satellite constellations to a, quote, a proliferated low Earth orbit architecture enabled by lower-cost commercial pace technology and access, unquote. Air Force officials hinted at these changes earlier this year when Shanahan visited Air Force Space Command in Colorado. The Air Force operates 77 satellites in orbit, while the Navy has 12 communications satellites, Wilson said. Satellites are really pretty fragile things, so we have to think about how do we defend a constellation. It's not always just direct defense, she said. It may be that we distribute a network. If you have multiple nodes, it's inherently more resilient than if you're relying on one thing. Some may be maneuverability, some of it may be deception. There's a lot of ways to make sure the United States can take a punch and keep on operating. Well, I don't know about you guys, but that story really blew me away. And some of this code language, I mean, this is why I think this show is really important, to be honest. Because this is all this stuff that no one even reports on. We didn't even hear about this. I actually wouldn't even have heard of this stuff if I hadn't been reading Dr. Carl Grossman's book. Decided to read it on my YouTube channel. And then Jana Thrift, the program manager, said, hey, why don't you put it on your show here and just put them together? So that's what I've been doing. But what does this sentence mean on this article? This week, the Pentagon is poised to announce a shift from a few independent satellite constellations to a proliferated low Earth orbit architecture. What the heck does that mean? Low Earth orbit architecture enabled by lower cost commercial pace, technology, and access. I think that means space technology and access. There's several typos in this article, by the way. But I don't know about you guys, but man, that just blew me away as I'm reading this articles and Dr. Helen Caldicott's book talking about nuclear war. We have completely taken it for granted. Don't mind me if I pour myself some water. I am parched. I'm telling you, folks, we got to pay attention. But this is a thing. I want us to remember not to get glum about all this stuff. I want us to feel empowered. Because I think that we came here on purpose. I really believe this. We came here to fight the good fight, to win over evil. The time is now because Mother Earth, Father Sky have been attacked. These guys are attacking Father Sky. It is time for us to stand up. I mean, I actually think that it's going to collapse under its weight. You know, this idea that Trump mulled it over. He didn't mull it over. He took orders. Carl Grossman wrote this. It's called The Vision for 2020, outlined in 1987. That's when it started. 1998, the long-range plan issued in 1998 explains its introduction. That vision for 2020 guides how our military space strategy will evolve in the 21st century and is the standard for measuring the progress of U.S. Spacecom, which is the U.S. Space Command and its components. They plan on having complete dominance in space. Period. That plan's going on. Trump did not, he mulled it over. This is all such propaganda. This is why, frankly, people like, CNN, you're horrible. You know, it's kind of sad that they pick on CNN because CNN is just like all of them, right? They all sort of frame it the way that the military-industrial complex wants them to do it. I don't know. Well, you know what I say on my YouTube channel all the time? Put your courage feet on, because we have to put our courage feet on. We don't have a choice. We have an obligation. We have children. And guess what? There's lots of good life left. It is fun. Life is great. Life is awesome. And we can stand up to these bullies and still enjoy life. Doesn't mean we have to get all upset and, isn't it all bad? Fukushima's really bad. The military's really bad. Well, yeah, that's all true. But guess what? There's a lot more good on this planet. In fact, you know how much good there is? There's billions more of us than there are of them. We are many, they are few. And we can keep our spirits up because we're awesome. We're magnificent. We love our Mother Earth and it loves us. We are symbiotic with the entire universe. And guess what? I really believe in the power of love. When I said in the intro, love is greater than fear, I believe that. And I really do believe that happiness is resistance, which is something I've been saying for a long, long time, not even before the resistance movement started. Whatever that means, resistance. I don't see much resistance in the streets, by the way, the resistance. You think you're going to vote for Democrats and get resistance? These guys are building spacecrafts up in satellites with lasers that are going to point down at you if you get out of line. So you think you're going to have like some democratic system? Gosh dang, man. But you know what? We can create democracy and we can choose, but it's going to require that we actually have democracy, that we actually choose it. You know, I like this idea. I've learned quite a bit being around Jana Thrift, actually, because the way she conducts meetings at KEPW, I, sit on the producers' meetings and sat in at the board meeting and stuff. And they do it by consensus basis. They really do a fair, from what I can see, they make a real effort at KEPW. David Zubin and Jana Thrift, they really work hard at making sure everybody's heard and we come to a consensus and we all talk about it. And that's what it takes. It takes us to be able to talk. And one of the things I've noticed is the Trumpsters, they don't like to talk. They like to tell. They like to tell you who you are. You get comments about, you're so dumb, you're so illiterate, you're so brain dead. What the YouTubers tell me tonight, liberals are just retarded. Because I make comments on YouTube, right? And I can't help it because, for goodness sakes, these people actually really believe that Donald Trump is doing anything for them. He's not doing jack for anybody but himself. And he's taking orders from the military. He plans on getting rich off the presidency. That's his program. So it's kind of a shock, to be honest. Like, this article, I'm so glad that I could share it with you. And I'm really, really grateful to Dr. Caldicott and to Dr. Grossman for allowing me to read their books to my audience here in the Northwest and on the internet. And, frankly, the Age of Fission radio show is going to be up on Spreaker. And Spreaker is an internet podcasting venue, and it airs it on iHeartRadio. It'll be on iTunes. It's going to be on YouTube. I think it will connect on YouTube through Age of Fission, AGEOFFISSION, just like this radio show. So I hope you guys enjoy this. This is a thing. We play this late at night here in KEPW, 10 o'clock at night or 11, I guess, 10 or 11. Because these are kind of harsh topics. And we also have it on Monday at 6 to talk to people about it, kind of on their way home. That's why we're reading Carl Grossman's book, sort of a lighter book than The New Nuclear Danger, because Dr. Caldicott, as you just heard in the reading, she's pretty graphic about what's going to happen. And we have forgotten what nuclear war looks like. A real nuclear attack, although we have seen a lot of nuclear attacks well, let's just talk about the bombing, the test bombing. That was like a nuclear attack on the whole entire planet, wasn't it? And the United States was actually the only nation to actually bomb its own people during the test site times. That was very interesting to learn about, But, we have these depleted uranium weapons that we sell now. The government has decided that, against the wishes of the entire rest of the world, we're going to sell depleted uranium. We're going to use depleted uranium. And we carpet bombed Iraq with depleted uranium weapons in some places. And it did affect our soldiers. And in fact, their cancers and their birth defects is one of the reasons that we had high suicide rates. And that is never talked about. So it's the new N word. You cannot talk about nuclear contamination, and that's what this show is about. We're going to talk about nuclear contamination, and we're going to talk about how to live and be happy and how to push back and demand that these these scientists, this is a thing with nuclear. We don't really have the answers. Like at Fukushima, it's going to take us 40 years to figure it out. Yeah, you think? It's probably going to take them a lot longer than 40 years, folks. It's going to take them a lot longer than 40 years because they're not actually really addressing the issue. They're just hem and hawing and going, yeah, how about another billion? I mean, they're milking the cash cow. That's what every nuclear site is about. And while I have a few minutes left on KEPW, I'm going to talk to you about the proximity factor. The proximity factor is the fact that the Columbia Generating Station, which sits on the Hanford nuclear waste dump site where they built the H-bomb, and there were, I think, 9 or 8 plutonium plants, or 7. Forgive me for not knowing the exact number. So it's one of the most contaminated sites on the planet, and tanks up there have to be maintained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, stupidly, and I think intentionally, maliciously, personally, that's a personal opinion, they built the Columbia Generating Station, which used to be called Whoops, but then that didn't sound so good, so they changed the name to something respectable called the Columbia Generating Station, and it is 12.7 miles away from Hanford. Now, if the Columbia Generating Station has a small meltdown where it has to close down for 2 weeks, which it could, because guess what? Turns out it's sitting on not 1, not 2, not 3, but several, more than 5 live active earthquake faults that the state of Washington is expecting to hit any time greater than a 6.0, which is the largest. They say it cannot take more than 6.4, and they're expecting a 6.6 at least. And it is 12.7 miles away from Hanford. If it had a meltdown, within 25 miles, they have to evacuate everyone for 2 weeks because you will die if you go in there within 25 miles of a nuclear meltdown. So you have to let it cool for 2 weeks, basically, before you can get back in to deal with the mess. Well, you know what that does to the tanks at Hanford? It leaves them unattended for 2 weeks. And according even to Tom Carpenter from Hanford Challenge, I interviewed him and said, am I incorrect in believing that this could actually cause one or more of those tanks to blow up because it can't be maintained? It'll just get so hot, it'll just implode. And he said, yeah, you know what? That's actually highly likely, highly probable. It's a real grave danger. So that's called the proximity. I deemed that the proximity factor, folks. And for that little bit of news at the end of the night, I want to suggest that you contact Peter DeFazio's office, Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley's office, and the mayor and the county commissioners and say, we need to work on getting the Columbia Generating Station shut down immediately. Not just because of the proximity factor, but because it's also losing over $500 million a year, and it's costing my utility bill to go up because we have to pay for it. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to be bringing to you guys, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's reading, and you have been listening to Lonnie Clark on the Age of Fission radio show.
Hey, mate, you've been listening to KEPW LP 97.3 FM, also live streaming on www.kepw.org.